Agent Marcus Hale adjusted his rearview mirror, catching sight of the dense woods lining the narrow road. He was headed for another undercover operation, but he didn't mind the drive. It allowed him a rare break, a chance to reflect and clear his mind. The sun had nearly set, casting a dim glow over the quiet landscape, and the isolation was oddly comforting. But as he drove through this small, sleepy town, he became aware of the lone set of headlights behind him, lingering far too close. Moments later, red and blue lights flashed in his mirror, and the sharp sound of a siren filled the air. Marcus sighed, pulling over to the side of the road, trying to keep his cool. He had no illusions about what this could be. He'd been in law enforcement long enough to recognize a pretextual stop. There was no reason for him to be pulled over. Still, he rested his hands on the wheel, keeping calm and preparing himself for whatever came next. Two officers approached the car with slow, calculated steps, their faces obscured by the glare of their flashlights. Marcus squinted, hoping the bright light was only an oversight, but he could feel the hostility radiating from them as they neared. "License and registration?" one of them barked, his tone cold and curt. Marcus moved slowly, reaching into his glove compartment. "Mind telling me what I was pulled over for, officer?" he asked, keeping his tone level. "Broken tail light," the officer snapped, shifting his flashlight to Marcus's face, studying him with an unblinking stare. But Marcus knew for a fact that his tail light was fine. He'd checked all his car's systems just that morning. "Is that so?" Marcus handed over his documents. "I'm an FBI agent," he said, keeping his voice steady. "I'm on my way to an assignment." The officer's face twisted into a smirk, and he snorted. "Sure you are," he sneered, sharing a glance with his partner, who chuckled. They looked Marcus up and down, as if sizing him up, their expressions filled with something darker than mere skepticism. Marcus held his ground, though he felt his patience waning. "If you call in my name, you'll get verification," he replied calmly. "Marcus Hale, badge number 4279. The officer tilted his head, as if considering Marcus's words for a brief moment. But instead of acknowledging him, he took a step back, holstering his flashlight and gesturing to his partner. "Step out of the car," he ordered. Marcus knew the drill. Resisting would only escalate things, and they clearly had no intention of listening. He unbuckled his seatbelt, stepping out with his hands visible. The officers immediately crowded him, one of them reaching behind him to secure his wrists. "Is this really necessary?" Marcus asked, clenching his jaw as the cold metal of handcuffs clamped around his wrists. "Oh, you think you're special because you can recite some numbers." The officer's voice was dripping with disdain. "Out here, we don't care what titles you claim to have. You're on our turf now." They pushed him toward their patrol car, not caring that his face hit the roof as they maneuvered him inside. Marcus gritted his teeth, feeling a wave of frustration mixed with anger. He'd dealt with difficult people on the job, but this blatant disregard, this assumption that he was less, stung in a way he hadn't anticipated. The ride to the station was silent, the officers exchanging only a few muttered words. Marcus could feel their contempt in every dismissive glance thrown his way. As they pulled into the station, he took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm. His mind was already working, observing every detail: the layout of the station, the officers' names on their badges, the glances they shared with others in the department as they led him inside. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room, the sharpness of their judgment as he was marched in, like a criminal. The officer who had first pulled him over shoved him into a chair, crossing his arms as he looked down at Marcus. "Let's get something straight," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You can drop the act. We know what you really are." "Are?" Marcus narrowed his eyes. "And what's that supposed to mean?" The officer sneered, a twisted smile forming on his face. "A nobody who thinks he's above the law," he spat. "Your kind doesn't last long around here." Marcus didn't flinch, but the words hit him like a punch. He knew better than to react, but he could feel anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. He could take this, he reminded himself, if it meant gathering more information, if it meant understanding the extent of the rot that seemed to permeate this place. They left him sitting in the chair, hands cuffed behind his back, for what felt like hours. He noted every detail: the clock ticking on the wall, the officers milling about, the way they all seemed to avoid his gaze, as if he were a disease. Occasionally he would catch snippets of their conversations, laced with coded words that suggested a pattern, a system that went beyond simple prejudice. Eventually, another officer, one who looked younger and slightly out of place among the hardened faces in the station, approached him. The young officer hesitated, glancing around nervously before finally speaking. "They're saying you're some kind of federal agent. That true?" Marcus met his gaze, sensing something different in the young man's demeanor, a flicker of doubt, maybe even curiosity. "Yes, that's true," he replied. "I'm with the FBI. They didn't bother to verify, did they?" The young officer's face tightened, and he cast a quick glance over his shoulder. "No, they didn't. But you shouldn't be here," he whispered, leaning closer. "This place, it's not right." Marcus nodded subtly. He could tell the young officer was genuine, possibly uncomfortable with what he'd witnessed. "Then maybe you could help me," he said softly. "Just give me a phone call." The officer hesitated, clearly torn, before finally giving a brief nod. "I'll see what I can do." He straightened, looking around once more before disappearing down the hall. As he waited, Marcus thought about the injustice of it all, the quiet resilience he'd had to maintain just to keep from lashing out. Every moment he spent in that chair felt like a battle against his own pride, against the urge to expose who he was right then and there. But he knew that a direct confrontation now would do nothing to change the core issues rotting this department from within. He needed to play it smart, to gather more, to leave no room for them to wriggle out of the consequences. Finally, the young officer returned, slipping a cell phone into Marcus's hand while making a show of adjusting his cuffs, as if it were a routine action. "Make it quick," he murmured before stepping away. Marcus dialed his supervisor's number, keeping his voice low as he spoke. "It's Marcus. I'm in custody at a local station. They ignored my credentials, and it seems like I'm not the first to experience this." There was a pause on the other end, then his supervisor's calm voice came through. "Understood. I'll initiate a covert investigation authorization. Do what you can to gather evidence." Marcus hung up, slipping the phone back into his pocket as the young officer returned to retrieve it. He met the officer's gaze, offering a subtle nod of thanks. The next few hours were grueling, with Marcus listening, watching, memorizing every detail. He saw how the officers interacted with certain locals, their dismissive glances, the way they laughed among themselves after roughing someone up. He noticed the bruises on the wrists of a man sitting in a cell nearby, his blank stare speaking of someone long broken by this cycle of abuse. Eventually, they moved him to a holding cell, where he was left alone. He leaned against the cold wall, allowing himself a moment to breathe, to center himself. He would get out of this, and when he did, he would bring the weight of justice down upon this place. Every sneer, every insult, every mocking glance would be accounted for. He'd make sure they regretted every single second they spent treating him like this. In that quiet cell, Marcus's resolve hardened. He had a mission now, and it wasn't just about getting out, it was about bringing down the system that had allowed this kind of hate to fester unchecked. As he sat in silence, listening to the distant murmurs of officers in the hallway, he made a silent vow. Marcus felt the weight of exhaustion settle in as he leaned back against the unforgiving wall of his cell. He'd spent hours in here, left with nothing but the sound of his own breathing and the occasional echo of voices from down the hall. Every instinct told him to fight back, to make them pay for every second of humiliation they had heaped on him. But he knew that impulse wouldn't serve him. Instead, he needed a plan, one that would cut deeper than just getting even. Finally, after what felt like a small eternity, the young officer from earlier returned. His face was tight with nerves as he unlocked Marcus's cell door and gestured for him to follow. Marcus rose slowly, his muscles stiff from sitting but his mind alert. The officer guided him through a side door, away from the glaring eyes of the other officers, and out into the dimly lit hallway. "They're letting you go," the young officer said in a low voice, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "But be careful. People don't just leave this place without consequences." Marcus absorbed the warning, nodding once. "I appreciate it," he replied, studying the young man's face. There was something almost haunted in his eyes, a look that spoke of someone who had seen too much but couldn't bring himself to act against it. "What's your name?" "Reese," he replied, barely meeting Marcus's gaze. "Look, just get out of here, okay? And maybe don't come back." Noted. But Marcus had no intention of leaving things alone. He stepped out of the station, inhaling deeply as the cool night air hit his face. Despite the bitterness of his release, he had the start of something, a foothold, a weakness within the department's ranks that could open up further. Reese was nervous, but he had a sliver of conscience, and that might be all Marcus needed. Once he was a safe distance from the station, Marcus pulled out his phone, dialing his FBI supervisor. "I'm out," he said, keeping his voice low. "They didn't believe my credentials, humiliated me in every way possible, and threw me in a cell for hours." The voice on the other end was calm, efficient. "Then we've got a case. You're authorized to conduct a covert investigation. Do what you need to do to expose their misconduct." Marcus's lips twisted into a grim smile. "Understood. I'll be in touch." He hung up, already forming his plan. His first step would be gathering evidence from the people in the community, understanding the extent of the department's reach. He knew he couldn't do it alone, though. He'd need local support, people who had felt the sharp edge of this town's hatred and were ready to fight back. The next morning he returned to the town, this time blending in under the guise of a federal auditor from the Department of Justice. With his new cover, he visited local businesses, community centers, and small gathering spots where people met regularly. His FBI badge remained tucked away, as he knew he'd have to earn these people's trust before they'd open up about their experiences with the police. At a small cafe on the edge of town, Marcus found his first lead. The cafe owner, a middle-aged black woman named Mrs. Thompson, eyed him warily as he ordered coffee, her posture tense and guarded. "You're not from around here, are you?" she asked, her voice edged with suspicion. Marcus shook his head, keeping his expression open. "Just passing through. I'm looking into some complaints about law enforcement in the area. Figured I'd start by talking to people in the community." She studied him for a moment, then let out a weary sigh. "People here don't like to talk about the police. Most of us just try to keep our heads down and stay out of their way." "Does that work?" Marcus asked softly, sensing the pain behind her words. Mrs. Thompson shook her head. "Not always. Some folks around here have had experiences." Her voice trailed off, as if the memories were too raw to put into words. But Marcus could tell there was more to her story, something she was holding back. "Look, I know it's hard to talk about these things," he said gently, "but I'm here to help. If you or anyone you know has been mistreated, I want to hear about it. And I promise, I'm not going to let this slide." She seemed to consider this, her gaze flickering toward the front window, as if checking for prying eyes. "There's a young man, Darren," she said finally. "Barely 18. He got roughed up by the police last month, said he was loitering. But all he was doing was waiting for his ride after his shift at the grocery store. They left him with a black eye and bruised ribs, and then they charged him with resisting arrest." Marcus felt a familiar surge of anger but kept his expression neutral. "Do you think he'd be willing to talk to me?" Mrs. Thompson hesitated, then nodded. "I'll see if I can get him to meet with you. But be careful. The people here, the ones in charge, they don't take kindly to anyone stirring things up." "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson," Marcus replied, giving her a reassuring nod. "I won't let them get away with this." Over the next few days, Marcus met with more locals, each story more gut-wrenching than the last. He spoke with Darren, who was wary at first but opened up after Marcus shared a bit about his own encounter with the police. The young man described the humiliation, the pain, and the helplessness he'd felt as the officers threw him to the ground, all because he had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. With each account, Marcus's resolve hardened. The stories painted a picture of a police department steeped in prejudice, a system that operated above the law with zero accountability. And it wasn't just young men like Darren. Elderly residents, single mothers, even children had been victims of the department's unchecked power. Each interview added a piece to the puzzle, and soon Marcus had enough evidence to take his findings to the FBI. But he wasn't finished yet. He knew that, to make the strongest case possible, he needed someone on the inside, someone who could corroborate the stories, someone who had seen the corruption firsthand. His thoughts drifted to Officer Reese, the young man who had shown a decency back at the station. If he could get Reese on his side, it would be the final piece he needed to bring this department down. That evening, Marcus waited outside the station, knowing Reese's shift would end soon. As the young officer stepped out into the parking lot, Marcus approached him, keeping his steps measured and non-threatening. "Reese," he called out, watching the young man stiffen before turning to face him. Reese's eyes widened with recognition, and a flicker of fear crossed his face. "What are you doing here?" he whispered, glancing around nervously. "Relax," Marcus replied, raising his hands slightly. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need a few minutes of your time." Reese hesitated, his eyes darting to the station entrance. After a moment, he nodded, motioning for Marcus to follow him to a quiet corner of the lot. "What do you want?" Reese asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know you see what's happening in this department," Marcus said, keeping his tone low and steady. "The harassment, the brutality, it's affecting this entire town. People are afraid, Reese. They're being hurt. And you're in a position to help put an end to it." Reese looked away, his jaw clenched. "You don't understand. If I speak out, they'll ruin me. They'll make sure I never work in law enforcement again." Marcus nodded, understanding the weight of that fear. "I get it. But you have a choice. You can either be part of the solution, or you can continue to be complicit. This department, it's toxic, and sooner or later, it's going to collapse under the weight of its own corruption. When that happens, you'll want to be on the right side of things. Reese's shoulders slumped, and for a moment Marcus thought he might refuse. But then the young officer let out a heavy sigh, nodding slowly. I've seen things that keep me up at night. But if I help you, I need to know that I won't be alone in this. Marcus extended his hand. You won't be. I've got resources, and once we have enough, we'll make sure this place can never hurt anyone again. After a long moment, Reese shook his hand, his grip firm but trembling. All right, I'll help you. But if this goes sideways, I'm trusting you to keep your word. You have my word, Marcus replied, his voice steady. We're going to bring them down. With Reese on his side, Marcus finally felt the pieces falling into place. Now he could dive even deeper, using Reese's inside knowledge to uncover the department's darkest secrets. As they parted ways, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that justice was no longer a distant dream, it was within reach. The next morning, Marcus reviewed his notes in the dim light of his rented motel room, piecing together every detail he and Reese had gathered. The accounts of abuse, the sham charges, and the viciousness displayed by the police department painted a damning picture, but he knew he needed more than just testimonials from the community. With Reese's help, he was now in position to obtain concrete, internal evidence from the department itself, evidence that would be indisputable. Reese had risked everything by agreeing to meet him again that day, this time with a list of names, officers who were involved in the department's most egregious abuses, from falsifying reports to brutalizing detainees. Among them were 2 high-ranking officers and even the police chief, who had built an empire of intimidation. Marcus understood now just how deep the corruption ran, and he was determined to expose every last detail. That evening, they met in Reese's car, parked on a quiet street away from the station. Reese handed Marcus a file filled with reports, some falsified, others suspiciously vague, all of which painted a damning picture of systematic misconduct. Marcus's eyes scanned the pages, the names and dates blending together into a tapestry of abuse that stretched back years. He felt a tightness in his chest as he read about fabricated charges, unjustified detentions, and incident reports that glossed over excessive force. You sure you're ready for this? Reese asked quietly, his face pale in the glow of the dashboard. Lights? Marcus looked up, his expression hard. These people can't keep doing this. We're going to make sure they answer for every single thing they've done. Reese nodded, though his hands shook slightly as he gripped the steering wheel. There's more. They have security footage archived in the basement of the station, bodycam footage, surveillance tapes. They keep it locked up tight, but if we could get our hands on it. Marcus's mind was already racing, piecing together a plan. That footage could be exactly what we need. If it shows even a fraction of what you and the community have described, it'll be enough to bring them down. Reese took a shaky breath. I could get you in after hours. Security is lighter then, but we'd have to move fast. Marcus nodded. Let's do it tonight. The sooner we have this evidence, the sooner we can shut this operation down. They spent the next few hours preparing. Reese detailed the layout of the station, marking where the security cameras were located, and where the guards typically rotated during the night shift. By the time they were ready, the town had settled into a quiet darkness, and the station would be operating on a skeleton crew. Reese glanced nervously at Marcus as they approached the back entrance. You ready? He whispered, the tension in his voice evident. Marcus gave a reassuring nod. We're doing this. Let's go. With Reese leading the way, they slipped inside, navigating the narrow hallways of the station. Marcus's senses were on high alert, his training taking over as they crept past offices and holding cells. Reese led him down a flight of stairs to the basement, where a thick metal door with a security keypad blocked their way. Reese punched in the code, and the door clicked open, revealing a cold, dimly lit room lined with shelves and filing cabinets. At the far end, several screens flickered, displaying footage from various cameras around town. A set of hard drives sat next to them, the dull hum of the servers filling the silence. Marcus moved quickly, his fingers deftly working to locate the specific tapes and footage Reese had mentioned. Reese kept watch by the door, his eyes darting back and forth. Hurry, he whispered urgently, glancing down the hallway. Marcus nodded, finding a stack of tapes labeled by date. His eyes scanned over the labels, recognizing the dates of some of the most recent abuses he'd documented. He grabbed several, slipping them into his bag, then turned to the computer. Logging in with a password Reese had provided, he began downloading files onto an encrypted drive. Each file represented another piece of evidence, a guarantee that justice would be served. Just as he finished, they heard footsteps echoing down the stairwell. Reese's face drained of color. We've got to go, he whispered, his voice taut with panic. Marcus stuffed the last of the drives into his bag, nodding to Reese. They slipped out of the room and down the hallway, moving quickly but quietly. As they reached the main floor, Marcus spotted the officer from the stairwell walking toward the basement door. But they managed to slip past just in time. The officer didn't see them. He continued down the stairs, unaware that anyone had been there at all. Outside, Marcus exhaled, adrenaline still pumping through his veins. Reese looked shaken but relieved. "We did it," he muttered, a nervous smile breaking across his face. "Yeah, we did," Marcus replied, his mind already racing with plans for their next steps. "This evidence, it's everything we need." They parted ways, and Marcus spent the rest of the night reviewing the footage. What he saw was worse than he'd imagined. The tapes showed officers taunting detainees, using excessive force on people who posed no threat, and laughing as they discussed falsifying charges. Every minute of footage was more damning than the last, revealing a department that not only tolerated but encouraged abuse. The next day, Marcus contacted his supervisor, detailing the evidence he'd obtained. His supervisor was silent for a long moment, then finally spoke. "We'll begin formal proceedings." "You've done good work, Marcus." But Marcus wasn't finished. The town needed to know what had been happening, and he was determined to make sure they saw it for themselves. He arranged a community meeting, inviting locals to gather at a nearby church, a place where they could feel safe enough to speak up. Reese agreed to come, and even some of the other community members who had shared their stories showed up, anxious yet hopeful. As people gathered, Marcus stepped to the front, meeting their expectant gazes. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice carrying over the quiet murmur of the crowd. "I know that many of you have suffered at the hands of the local police department, and I want you to know that your voices will be heard. Today, we're going to show you the truth." He connected his laptop to the projector, and the first clip played on the screen. The room fell silent as they watched an officer throw a young man to the ground, laughing as he handcuffed him. The officer on screen used slurs, calling him names, taunting him as the young man struggled. Gasps and murmurs filled the room, disbelief and anger rippling through the crowd. Mrs. Thompson covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes wide with shock. Darren clenched his fists, his face a mix of rage and pain. One by one, Marcus played the tapes, each clip exposing another instance of brutality and racism. Every face in the room reflected the same horror, the same realization that what they had endured was not isolated but part of a larger, sickening pattern. When the final clip ended, Marcus looked out at the crowd. "This is the reality of our local law enforcement. This is what they've been doing, unchecked for years. But it ends now. I have taken this evidence to the federal authorities, and an investigation is underway." The room erupted in applause, a wave of relief and anger mingling as the community finally saw a path to justice. Reese, standing at the back, met Marcus's gaze, a look of gratitude in his eyes. Marcus nodded subtly, acknowledging the courage it had taken for Reese to help him. But just as the applause began to die down, the church doors swung open, and a group of police officers entered, led by the police chief himself. His face was twisted in a sneer as he surveyed the crowd, his eyes narrowing when they landed on Marcus. "What's the meaning of this?" the chief demanded, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think you can come into my town and undermine my department?" Marcus didn't flinch, his expression calm as he stepped forward. "I'm not just some outsider, Chief. I'm with the FBI, and I have enough evidence to bring charges against every officer involved in the abuses we just witnessed." The chief's face turned red, his fists clenching. "You think you're untouchable because you're federal?" He spat. "This is my town, my rules." "Not anymore," Marcus replied, his voice steely. "Your time of terrorizing this community is over." The crowd watched, emboldened by Marcus's words. Reese stepped forward, standing beside Marcus, his posture tall and unyielding. The chief's gaze flicked to him, betrayal flashing in his eyes. "You're making a big mistake, son," the chief growled, his tone laced with menace. "No, sir," Reese replied, his voice steady. "The mistake was thinking we'd keep silent forever." The chief's expression hardened, but Marcus could see the fear creeping into his eyes. He knew the evidence was irrefutable, and he was outnumbered. Marcus took a step forward, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're done here, Chief. The federal investigation will take over from here. I suggest you cooperate, or you'll only make things worse for yourself." The chief glared at Marcus, his pride visibly crumbling. With one last hateful look, he turned and stormed out, his officers trailing behind him, their authority shattered. As the doors closed behind them, the room filled with cheers. Marcus took a moment to soak in the victory, knowing the battle was only just beginning. But he was ready, and so was this community. Together they would see justice served. As the applause echoed through the church, Marcus felt a powerful sense of accomplishment and relief wash over him. But he knew this was only the beginning. The chief's angry retreat, though public and humiliating, was a temporary victory. Men like him with power and deep-seated hatred did not go down easily. Marcus had seen it before. Pride, anger, and the belief that they were untouchable could drive men to extreme lengths to protect themselves. After the crowd slowly began to disperse, Marcus and Reese met in the quiet of the church hallway, away from the few lingering people who had stayed to thank Marcus for exposing the truth. Reese looked around nervously, his face pale. "You know they won't just take this lying down, right?" he said, voice barely a whisper. "The chief's going to do everything he can to make this go away." Marcus nodded. "I'm counting on it. That's why we're going to keep pushing, and we're not giving them a single inch. If he tries anything, we'll make sure it adds to the case against him." Reese nodded, though his hands shook as he shoved them into his pockets. "What's our next move?" "Tonight I'll send everything we have to the FBI headquarters and let them know what happened here today. The sooner we get federal oversight in place, the safer the community will be." They walked out of the church together, and Marcus could feel Reese's nervous energy beside him. Reese was brave, but he was young and untested, and Marcus knew the weight of what he'd risked was pressing on him. As they stepped outside into the cool night, Reese hesitated, glancing around at the few cars parked nearby. "You think they'll come after me?" Marcus placed a firm hand on Reese's shoulder. "They might try, but that's why you're not alone in this. Keep your head down for now. If anything seems off, you call me immediately. Understand?" Reese nodded, visibly reassured. "Yeah, okay. Thanks, Marcus." They parted ways, and Marcus walked back to his motel, feeling the heaviness of his own exhaustion settle over him. Inside his room, he meticulously organized the files and footage, preparing them for transfer. He sent everything to his supervisor, along with a detailed account of the confrontation at the church. His report emphasized the community's willingness to cooperate, the chief's veiled threats, and the urgency of federal intervention. He could only hope it would be enough to expedite the investigation. The next morning, Marcus's phone buzzed with a message from his supervisor: "Additional agents en route. Temporary federal oversight begins Monday. Hold position until then." Relief washed over Marcus. Federal oversight was exactly what they needed to keep the chief and his officers in check. But Monday was still a few days away, and anything could happen before then. He made a mental note to stay vigilant, knowing that the department wouldn't take this lying down. As Marcus moved through the town that day, he noticed a shift in the way people looked at him. He'd become a symbol of hope, the one who had taken a stand. Locals who had been wary or silent before now approached him with nods of respect, quiet words of encouragement, and even thanks. It was clear that his actions had stirred something in the community, and he felt a swell of pride knowing they felt empowered. But his actions had also stirred something darker. By afternoon, Marcus noticed an unmarked police cruiser parked outside his motel. It wasn't uncommon for law enforcement to pass through, but the car remained there, idling, with two officers inside who made no attempt to hide their scrutiny. Ignoring them, Marcus went about his day, careful to stay out in the open, aware of every gaze that followed him. He knew he couldn't afford to let his guard down. He checked in with Reese periodically, reassuring him that help was on the way, but Marcus could sense the young officer's mounting anxiety. The following evening, Marcus received a text from Reese: "They're watching me. Chief called me into his office today. He's suspicious." Marcus's gut tightened. He knew that this was the start of the chief's retaliation. He texted back, "Stay calm. Don't give them a reason to suspect you further. Federal oversight is coming. Just hold on." But later that night, Marcus's instincts told him things were escalating faster than he anticipated. As he returned to his motel room, he noticed his door was slightly ajar. He tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward his holstered gun as he pushed the door open and scanned the room. It looked undisturbed at first glance, but as he moved inside, he noticed subtle signs: papers slightly shifted, drawers left partially open. Someone had been here. Marcus's jaw clenched. It was a clear warning. They were trying to intimidate him, hoping he'd back down before he could deliver his evidence in person. But if they thought a little intimidation would scare him off, they were sorely mistaken. The next day, Marcus made a point of showing up in town, projecting an air of calm defiance. He knew the chief was watching, waiting for any sign of fear, any indication that his tactic was working. But Marcus gave him nothing. Instead, he approached the townspeople, checking in with those who had shared their stories, making sure they were safe and hadn't faced further harassment. Later that afternoon, he received another call from his supervisor. "Marcus, I've spoken with the Department of Justice. Given the aggression from local law enforcement, they're dispatching a team of federal marshals. They'll arrive with the oversight team. I want you to stay low until then. I hear you, Marcus replied, feeling a weight lift slightly at the news. And Reese? We're working on bringing him under federal protection, but for now, tell him to lie low. We don't want to tip off the chief. Marcus hung up, determined to see this through to the end. He texted Reese again, relaying his supervisor's instructions. Keep calm. Help is coming. Just stay out of sight and don't engage. But Reese's response made Marcus's stomach drop. Too late. They're here at my house. Chief's men are outside. Marcus called Reese immediately. Where are you? He demanded, his voice urgent. I'm in my room. They've been outside for a while now. I think they're waiting for me to come out, Reese whispered, panic evident in his voice. Listen to me, Reese. Lock your door, stay quiet, and don't do anything until I get there, Marcus ordered, his mind racing as he grabbed his keys and bolted from his room. He drove through the town, heart pounding as he approached Reese's house. He parked a few blocks away, taking a circuitous route to avoid being seen. As he neared the house, he spotted the unmarked police car outside, 2 officers watching the property with hawk-like intensity. Moving carefully, Marcus slipped around the side of the house, tapping on Reese's bedroom window. A moment later, the window slid open, and Reese's anxious face appeared. Marcus, he breathed, relief flooding his expression. What are we going to do? Marcus gestured for him to stay quiet, signaling him to climb out the window. We're going to get you somewhere safe. Just follow me, and don't make a sound. Reese climbed out, moving as silently as possible. They crept around the back of the house and into the shadows, moving quickly away from the waiting officers. Marcus led him through a series of back streets until they reached his car, and they climbed in, breathing heavily. Where are we going? Reese asked, his voice still shaking. To a safe place until federal backup arrives, Marcus replied, his tone firm. They'll be here soon. Just hang tight. They drove in silence, tension thick in the air, as Marcus navigated through the darkened streets. He took Reese to a safe location he'd scoped out earlier, an empty warehouse on the outskirts of town where they could wait without drawing attention. As they settled in, Marcus kept his phone on, checking for updates from his supervisor, counting the hours until federal backup arrived. Reese sat beside him, visibly shaken. I didn't think they'd actually come for me like that, he murmured, staring at the ground. That's how men like the chief operate, Marcus replied grimly. They prey on fear, thinking they can silence anyone who threatens their power. But we're not letting them get away with this. Reese looked at Marcus, a flicker of determination returning to his eyes. You're right. I'm tired of being afraid. They spent the night in the warehouse, remaining vigilant as the hours crawled by. Marcus's phone finally buzzed just before dawn with a message from his supervisor. Federal team arriving at 8 a.m. Meet at town hall. Marcus exhaled, feeling a rush of relief. It's time, he said, turning to Reese. They're here. They left the warehouse and headed toward the town hall, where the federal team would establish their temporary headquarters. As they arrived, Marcus saw the fleet of government vehicles and a team of marshals stepping out, ready to secure the town. One of the lead agents approached Marcus, extending a hand. Agent Hale, we're here to take over. Marcus shook his hand, nodding toward Reese. This is Officer Reese. He's been instrumental in providing evidence against the department. Make sure he's protected. The agent nodded, gesturing to his team to escort Reese to safety. Reese met Marcus's eyes, gratitude shining through the exhaustion and fear. Thank you, Reese said quietly. I wouldn't have made it without you. Marcus nodded, giving him a reassuring look. You did the right thing, Reese. Now go. We'll handle the rest. As Reese was led away, Marcus joined the federal team, briefing them on the situation, sharing the evidence, and outlining the plan to bring the department under control. Today, justice would finally be served. As the applause echoed through the church, Marcus felt a powerful sense of accomplishment and relief wash over him. But he knew this was only the beginning. The chief's angry retreat, though public and humiliating, was a temporary victory. Men like him, with power and deep-seated hatred, did not go down easily. Marcus had seen it before. Pride, anger, and the belief that they were untouchable could drive men to extreme lengths to protect themselves. After the crowd slowly began to disperse, Marcus and Reese met in the quiet of the church hallway, away from the few lingering people who had stayed to thank Marcus for exposing the truth. Reese looked around nervously, his face pale. You know they won't just take this lying down, right? He said, voice barely a whisper. The chief's going to do everything he can to make this go away. Marcus nodded. I'm counting on it. That's why we're going to keep pushing, and we're not giving them a single inch. If he tries anything, we'll make sure it adds to the case against him. Reese nodded, though his hands shook as he shoved them into his pockets. What's our next move? Tonight I'll send everything we have to the FBI headquarters and let them know what happened here today. The sooner we get federal oversight in place, the safer the community will be. They walked out of the church together, and Marcus could feel Reese's nervous energy beside him. Reese was brave, but he was young and untested, and Marcus knew the weight of what he'd risked was pressing on him. As they stepped outside into the cool night, Reese hesitated, glancing around at the few cars parked nearby. You think they'll come after me? Marcus placed a firm hand on Reese's shoulder. They might try, but that's why you're not alone in this. Keep your head down for now. If anything seems off, you call me immediately. Understand? Reese nodded, visibly reassured. Yeah, okay, thanks, Marcus. They parted ways, and Marcus walked back to his motel, feeling the heaviness of his own exhaustion settle over him. Inside his room, he meticulously organized the files and footage, preparing them for transfer. He sent everything to his supervisor, along with a detailed account of the confrontation at the church. His report emphasized the community's willingness to cooperate, the chief's veiled threats, and the urgency of federal intervention. He could only hope it would be enough to expedite the investigation. The next morning, Marcus's phone buzzed with a message from his supervisor, additional agents en route. Temporary federal oversight begins Monday. Hold position until then. Relief washed over Marcus. Federal oversight was exactly what they needed to keep the chief and his officers in check. But Monday was still a few days away, and anything could happen before then. He made a mental note to stay vigilant, knowing that the department wouldn't take this lying down. As Marcus moved through the town that day, he noticed a shift in the way people looked at him. He'd become a symbol of hope, the one who had taken a stand. Locals who had been wary or silent before now approached him with nods of respect, quiet words of encouragement, and even thanks. It was clear that his actions had stirred something in the community, and he felt a swell of pride knowing they felt empowered. But his actions had also stirred something darker. By afternoon, Marcus noticed an unmarked police cruiser parked outside his motel. It wasn't uncommon for law enforcement to pass through, but the car remained there, idling, with two officers inside who made no attempt to hide their scrutiny. Ignoring them, Marcus went about his day, careful to stay out in the open, aware of every gaze that followed him. He knew he couldn't afford to let his guard down. He checked in with Reese periodically, reassuring him that help was on the way, but Marcus could sense the young officer's mounting anxiety. The following evening, Marcus received a text from Reese. They're watching me. Chief called me into his office today. He's suspicious. Marcus's gut tightened. He knew that this was the start of the chief's retaliation. He texted back, stay calm. Don't give them a reason to suspect you further. Federal oversight is coming. Just hold on. But later that night, Marcus's instincts told him things were escalating faster than he anticipated. As he returned to his motel room, he noticed his door was slightly ajar. He tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward his holstered gun as he pushed the door open and scanned the room. It looked undisturbed at first glance, but as he moved inside, he noticed subtle signs: papers slightly shifted, drawers left partially open. Someone had been here. Marcus's jaw clenched. It was a clear warning. They were trying to intimidate him, hoping he'd back down before he could deliver his evidence in person. But if they thought a little intimidation would scare him off, they were sorely mistaken. The next day, Marcus made a point of showing up in town, projecting an air of calm defiance. He knew the chief was watching, waiting for any sign of fear, any indication that his tactic was working. But Marcus gave him nothing. Instead, he approached the townspeople, checking in with those who had shared their stories, making sure they were safe and hadn't faced further harassment. Later that afternoon, he received another call from his supervisor. Marcus, I've spoken with the Department of Justice. Given the aggression from local law enforcement, they're dispatching a team of federal marshals. They'll arrive with the oversight team. I want you to stay low until then. I hear you, Marcus replied, feeling a weight lift slightly at the news. And Reese? We're working on bringing him under federal protection, but for now, tell him to lie low. We don't want to tip off the chief. Marcus hung up, determined to see this through to the end. He texted Reese again, relaying his supervisor's instructions. Keep calm. Help is coming. Just stay out of sight and don't engage. But Reese's response made Marcus's stomach drop. Too late. They're here at my house. Chief's men are outside. Up. Marcus called Reese immediately. Where are you? He demanded, his voice urgent. I'm in my room. They've been outside for a while now. I think they're waiting for me to come out, Reese whispered, panic evident in his voice. Listen to me, Reese. Lock your door, stay quiet, and don't do anything until I get there, Marcus ordered, his mind racing as he grabbed his keys and bolted from his room. He drove through the town, heart pounding as he approached Reese's house. He parked a few blocks away, taking a circuit to it to avoid being seen. As he neared the house, he spotted the unmarked police car outside, 2 officers watching the property with hawk-like intensity. Moving carefully, Marcus slipped around the side of the house, tapping on Reese's bedroom window. A moment later, the window slid open, and Reese's anxious face appeared. "Marcus," he breathed, relief flooding his expression. "What are we going to do?" Marcus gestured for him to stay quiet, signaling him to climb out the window. "We're going to get you somewhere safe. Just follow me, and don't make a sound." Reese climbed out, moving as silently as possible. They crept around the back of the house and into the shadows, moving quickly away from the waiting officers. Marcus led him through a series of back streets until they reached his car, and they climbed in, breathing heavily. "Where are we going?" Reese asked, his voice still shaking. "To a safe place until federal backup arrives," Marcus replied, his tone firm. "They'll be here soon. Just hang tight." They drove in silence, tension thick in the air, as Marcus navigated through the darkened streets. He took Reese to a safe location he'd scoped out earlier, an empty warehouse on the outskirts of town where they could wait without drawing attention. As they settled in, Marcus kept his phone on, checking for updates from his supervisor, counting the hours until federal backup arrived. Reese sat beside him, visibly shaken. "I didn't think they'd actually come for me like that," he murmured, staring at the ground. "That's how men like the chief operate," Marcus replied grimly. "They prey on fear, thinking they can silence anyone who threatens their power. But we're not letting them get away with this." Reese looked at Marcus, a flicker of determination returning to his eyes. "You're right. I'm tired of being afraid." They spent the night in the warehouse, remaining vigilant as the hours crawled by. Marcus's phone finally buzzed just before dawn with a message from his supervisor, federal team arriving at 8 a.m. "Meet at town hall." Marcus exhaled, feeling a rush of relief. "It's time," he said, turning to Reese. "They're here." They left the warehouse and headed toward the town hall, where the federal team would establish their temporary headquarters. As they arrived, Marcus saw the fleet of government vehicles and a team of marshals stepping out, ready to secure the town. One of the lead agents approached Marcus, extending a hand. "Agent Hale, we're here to take over." Marcus shook his hand, nodding toward Reese. "This is Officer Reese. He's been instrumental in providing evidence against the department. Make sure he's protected." The agent nodded, gesturing to his team to escort Reese to safety. Reese met Marcus's eyes, gratitude shining through the exhaustion and fear. "Thank you," Reese said quietly. "I wouldn't have made it without you." Marcus nodded, giving him a reassuring look. "You did the right thing, Reese. Now go. We'll handle the rest." As Reese was led away, Marcus joined the federal team, briefing them on the situation, sharing the evidence, and outlining the plan to bring the department under control. Today, justice would finally be served. At precisely 8 a.m., Marcus stood outside the town hall with a team of federal agents, marshals, and Doge officials who had been briefed on the full extent of the corruption in the police department. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a faint glow over the quiet streets, but the tension was thick in the air. Marcus knew that the chief and his men would be watching, waiting for the first signs of federal intervention. "Everyone clear on the plan?" Marcus asked, glancing at the team around him. The lead agent, a tall woman named Agent Taurus, nodded. "We've coordinated with the DOE. We'll make the arrests quickly, secure the evidence at the station, and bring the officers into federal custody. We're prioritizing the high-ranking officers first, Chief Donner and his direct subordinates. We want this to go as smoothly as possible." Marcus's jaw tightened. He knew the risks. If any of the officers sensed what was happening and decided to go down fighting, things could turn violent. But the team was prepared, and they all understood the importance of maintaining control. For the people of this town, justice was long overdue. They moved out, heading to the police station in an organized convoy. As they pulled up outside the station, Marcus could see the surprise and panic on the faces of the officers who noticed the line of federal vehicles pulling in. He and Torres led the team through the front entrance, agents flanking them on either side, their expressions steely and unyielding. Inside, the officers froze, glancing nervously at one another as they realized the gravity of the situation. The chief was nowhere in sight, but his second-in-command, Captain Mills, stepped forward, a look of forced bravado on his face. "What's the meaning of this?" Mills demanded, his voice a mix of anger and fear. "This is a police station, not a circus. You have no authority here." Agent Torres stepped forward, holding up her badge with a calm but firm expression. We're here on federal orders to place certain individuals within this department under arrest for numerous violations, including corruption, abuse of power, and falsification of evidence. This station is now under federal oversight." The room fell silent, the officers exchanging uncertain glances. Mills's face went pale, his bluster quickly dissolving as he realized the extent of the situation. "This is a mistake," he stammered, his voice faltering. You can't just come in here and take over." "We have more than enough evidence," Marcus said, stepping forward. He met Mills's gaze, his own eyes cold. "It's over, Mills. You and the chief don't control this town anymore." Mills opened his mouth to protest, but two marshals stepped forward, cuffing him before he could utter another word. He struggled briefly, but the realization of his predicament settled over him, and he fell silent, glaring at Marcus with pure hatred. With Mills secured, Marcus and Torres led the team deeper into the station, moving with practiced efficiency. Agents dispersed to gather evidence, securing files, seizing surveillance footage, and collecting body cam recordings that had been kept hidden or doctored. The officers remaining in the station were ordered to stay where they were, their faces a mix of shock, anger, and for some a glimmer of relief. As Marcus reached the chief's office, he could feel his pulse quicken. The door was closed, but he could see a shadow moving inside. He signaled for two agents to flank the door, nodding for Torres to stand ready. Then he knocked, the sound echoing in the sudden quiet of the station. "Chief Donner," he called, his voice steady. "It's over. We have a federal warrant for your arrest. Come out peacefully, and this can go a lot easier for you." Silence. For a long moment nothing happened. Then, the door creaked open, and Chief Donner stood in the doorway, his face flushed with barely controlled rage. His eyes darted between Marcus, Torres, and the agents, assessing his options. "You think you can waltz in here and take everything I've built?" He snarled, his voice thick with contempt. "This is my town. I've kept order here. You don't know what it's like." "What you call order is oppression," Marcus replied coldly. "We have proof of your crimes, Chief. There's no way out of this." For a moment Donner looked like he might resist, his hand twitching as if reaching for something. But the steely gazes of the agents around him gave him pause. Slowly he raised his hands, his face twisting in fury as two agents stepped forward to cuff him. "This isn't over," Donner spat as they let him out. "You think these people are on your side? They're just animals. You'll see. The moment you leave, they'll turn on each other." Marcus's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing. "You're the only one who's been treating them like that, Chief. The people of this town deserve better than you." Donner sneered, his eyes filled with a venomous hatred, but he said nothing more as he was led away. Marcus watched him go, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and lingering anger. This man had held the town in a grip of fear for years, and now, finally, he was powerless. With Donner and Mills in custody, the team worked quickly to secure the rest of the evidence. As they moved through the station, Marcus could feel the atmosphere shift. Some officers seemed defiant, clinging to the loyalty they had for their disgraced chief, while others looked relieved, even grateful. It was clear that not everyone in the department had been complicit, and Marcus made a mental note to ensure that the investigation distinguished between those who had followed orders out of fear and those who had embraced the corruption willingly. By midday, the station was under complete federal control. The agents had compiled a wealth of evidence, enough to ensure that the department's crimes would be brought to light in a court of law. Marcus and Torres gathered in the chief's office, reviewing the stacks of files they'd seized, each one another piece in the puzzle of the department's corruption. "You did good work here, Hale," Torres said, glancing over at him. "You and Reese both. This is going to make a real difference." Marcus nodded, feeling a sense of fulfillment that he hadn't felt in a long time. The town deserves to be free from men like Donner. They deserve a chance to rebuild. Torres gave him a thoughtful look. "You planning to stay around for that?" Marcus hesitated, considering her words. He had come here for an assignment, but he had found something far more personal, a fight worth seeing through to the end. "Maybe," he replied quietly. "At least until things settle down. I want to make sure the community is safe." Torres nodded, understanding. "Well, whatever you decide, you have the Bureau's full support. We'll be monitoring things closely." They worked through the afternoon, finalizing reports and ensuring that the transition to federal oversight would be smooth. As evening approached, Marcus stepped outside, taking a moment to breathe in the cool air and reflect on everything that had happened. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the town, and he could feel the weight of the day's events settling over him. As he looked around, he noticed familiar faces from the community gathering nearby: Mrs. Thompson, Darren, and a few others who had been instrumental in bringing the truth to light. They approached him, their expressions a mix of gratitude and relief. Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you, Agent Hale. For everything. We didn't think anyone would ever stand up to him." Marcus offered her a warm smile. "You all did the hard part. I just helped bring it to the surface." Darren, the young man who had been brutalized by the police, stepped forward, his gaze steady. "You gave us hope, man. That's something none of us had in a long time." Marcus nodded, feeling a surge of pride. This town had been through so much, and yet, here they stood, ready to face whatever came next with resilience and courage. He could see the beginnings of something new, a community that was no longer divided by fear, but united by their shared struggle. As the crowd dispersed, Marcus's phone buzzed with a call from Reese, who was now safe and in federal protection. He answered, hearing the young officer's voice filled with relief. "Marcus, I just wanted to thank you. I know it wasn't easy, but we did it." Marcus smiled. "You were brave, Reese. You stood up when it mattered most. Don't forget that." They exchanged a few more words, Reese's voice filled with a newfound sense of confidence. Marcus knew that Reese would carry this experience with him, that he would be stronger for it. As he hung up, Marcus looked out over the town, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. Justice had been served, and the people of this town could finally begin to heal. He didn't know if he would stay, or if he would move on to his next assignment, but one thing was certain: he had made a difference here, and that was something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. With a final glance back at the station, Marcus turned and walked into the twilight, ready for whatever came next. In the weeks that followed, the town's atmosphere shifted like the first breath of spring after a long, bitter winter. With Chief Donner and his accomplices now facing federal charges, the local police department underwent a complete overhaul. Federal oversight remained in place, led by Agent Torres and her team, who diligently worked to rebuild the department from within. Several officers who had been coerced or had simply stayed silent under Donner's reign stepped forward, cooperating with federal agents and providing valuable testimony that would strengthen the case against their former colleagues. Marcus stayed in town to assist with the transition, his presence a reassuring constant for the community as they adjusted to a new reality. The people he had come to know, Mrs. Thompson, Darren, and so many others who had shared their stories of mistreatment and injustice, had grown to see him as more than just an agent. He was a symbol of the accountability they had longed for, a reminder that justice was possible. One afternoon, Marcus met with Torres in her temporary office at the station. She looked up from a stack of paperwork as he entered, motioning for him to take a seat. "We've made incredible progress here," she said, a note of satisfaction in her voice. "The DOE is pleased, and they're confident that with the right leadership, this department can regain the community's trust." Marcus nodded. "It's a good start. The community's resilient, they just needed someone to listen, to take them seriously. They're ready to move forward." Torres leaned back, studying him. "And what about you? Are you planning on staying here, or are you thinking about heading back to the bureau?" He hesitated, glancing out the window at the town he had come to care about. He had only intended to stay as long as it took to dismantle Donner's grip on the community, but something about this place had changed him. "I'm not sure yet," he admitted. "There's still a lot to be done here, and I've been talking with some of the community leaders. They're thinking of forming a civilian oversight board to keep an eye on things moving forward. They asked me to help." Torres raised an eyebrow, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "A civilian oversight board? That could be exactly what this town needs, a system to keep things balanced, prevent the kind of abuses that were happening here." Marcus nodded. "The community is ready to take responsibility for itself. They want to be part of the solution, not just victims of the problem. If I can help them build that, it would feel like the work here is truly complete." Torres nodded approvingly. "Well, you'd have the Bureau's blessing, if that's what you decide. After everything you've done here, they'd support you staying on as a consultant to help with the transition. And honestly, Marcus, I think you'd be perfect for it." He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. The Bureau had been his life for years, and he'd always thought his path was set, that his assignments would lead him from one case to the next. But now, for the first time, he could see a different path, a chance to put down roots, to leave a lasting impact on a place that needed change. The next day, Marcus met with the town's leaders at the community center. Mrs. Thompson was there, along with several others, including Darren and a few business owners, teachers, and clergy members. They had come together, united in their commitment to build a safer, more just community. They welcomed Marcus with smiles and nods of respect, expressions that conveyed a sense of gratitude and hope. "We've been discussing this oversight board," Mrs. Thompson began, looking around at the group. "We want it to be a body that the people can trust, something transparent and accountable. but we don't exactly know how to get it started." Marcus leaned forward, his hands resting on the table. "It's a good idea," he said, meeting each person's gaze. "A civilian oversight board can be a powerful tool for keeping law enforcement accountable. But it has to be done right. You'll need a structure, policies, a mission that reflects what you want to accomplish. And you'll need people who are truly committed to making it work." Darren, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "People need to know they can come forward without fear, that they'll be heard, and that things will actually change. We can't just have a board that sits in a room and files reports. It has to be active." Marcus nodded, impressed by the young man's insight. "Exactly. You'll need a way for people to file complaints safely, without fear of retaliation. And the board should work closely with the department, meeting regularly, reviewing policies, and making recommendations. Transparency is key. People need to see what's happening, not just hear about it." The group discussed their ideas late into the evening, each member contributing thoughts on how the board could operate. They talked about electing representatives from different parts of the community, creating a rotating chair position, and setting up regular public meetings. By the end of the night, they had sketched out a rough framework, a vision for a future where the people of the town would have a voice in their own safety. Over the following weeks, Marcus worked alongside them, helping to establish the board and guiding them through the process of drafting policies and procedures. He trained them on how to handle complaints, conduct investigations, and work with law enforcement in a constructive but firm manner. He wanted them to succeed, to create something strong enough to withstand any future threats, any attempts to return to the old ways. The Civilian Oversight Board held its first official meeting in early summer, with the entire town invited to attend. The meeting took place in the community center, the room filled with people who had come to witness this new chapter in their town's history. The atmosphere was charged with a mix of excitement and determination, a feeling that something truly transformative was happening. Marcus watched from the back as Mrs. Thompson, the newly elected chairwoman of the board, stood before the audience and addressed them. Her voice was strong, her words filled with conviction. "Today we're taking our town back," she declared. "We're building a community where everyone has a voice, where our concerns are heard, and where justice is not just a word, but a reality." The crowd erupted in applause, and Marcus felt a swell of pride. This was what he had fought for, what he had envisioned on those long, difficult nights in the station, piecing together evidence and listening to people's stories of pain and resilience. He had given the town the push it needed, but they were the ones taking control, creating something new and lasting. After the meeting, Marcus spoke with several townspeople, answering questions and offering advice. He could see the gratitude in their faces, the recognition that they had a fresh start, a chance to create a better future. And in that moment, he realized that his work here was done. The town was in good hands, and they were more than capable of moving forward without him. That evening, he met with Reese one last time. The young officer had been instrumental in exposing the corruption, and he had grown visibly stronger, more confident in the weeks since the chief's arrest. He would play a vital role in helping the department rebuild and regain the community's trust. "You're going to do great things here," Reese, Marcus said, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "The town needs people like you, someone who knows what they've been through and who's willing to do things right." Reese smiled, a hint of pride in his eyes. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Marcus. You showed me what it means to stand up, even when it's hard." They shook hands, and Marcus felt a sense of closure settle over him. He had done what he came to do, and now it was time to move on. He had given the town the tools they needed to protect themselves, to hold their leaders accountable, and to build a safer, more inclusive community. As he packed his belongings the next morning and prepared to leave, he took one last drive through the town. The streets were quiet and peaceful, filled with people who could finally go about their lives without fear. He passed by the community center, where the oversight board would meet regularly, a place where voices would be heard, where grievances would be addressed. Finally, he stopped by Mrs. Thompson's cafe. She greeted him with a warm smile, a knowing look in her eyes. "Leaving us, are you?" she asked, her voice soft but understanding. Marcus nodded, a hint of a smile on his lips. "My work here is done. You all have what you need now." Mrs. Thompson reached across the counter, squeezing his hand. "You'll always have a place here, Marcus, and we won't forget what you did for us." They exchanged a few more words, and then Marcus left, feeling a mix of pride and bittersweet gratitude. He had become a part of this town's story, and they had become a part of his. As he drove out of town, the sun shining brightly overhead, Marcus felt a sense of peace. He had given the town a fresh start, a chance to rebuild from the ground up. And as he looked back one last time, He knew that he had left it in good hands, in the hands of a community that would never allow itself to be oppressed again.